They call the Kentucky Derby the most exciting 2 minutes in sports. Every year on the first Saturday in May, millions of people across the world turn their attention to Louisville, Kentucky and Churchill Downs. But the Derby may not be the event it is today without the vital and winning role of African Americans. The story of African Americans' impact on thoroughbred racing begins with the very first Kentucky Derby in 1875, when the race was won by Aristides and the winning jockey was Oliver Lewis. Come along for a ride that takes us around the track and across the world to highlight a few of the African Americans who dominated thoroughbred racing. This is The Ride of Their Lives, told by Chris Goodlett of the Kentucky Derby Museum.
Folks that come to the Derby Museum, that contact us via phone or email or just come to visit us, are very fascinated with the story of African-American jockeys in thoroughbred racing in the Kentucky Derby. African-American jockeys had been with us for a long time. It really goes back to the earliest times of our country, goes back to the time of European settlement and colonization. African Americans that worked on those plantations, that took care of most things in regards to those plantations, also took care of the horses. It means they got to know those horses and to know their idiosyncrasies, and it means they eventually were the jockeys for those horses. And that continued after emancipation. We get to the first Kentucky Derby in 1875. African American jockeys make up 13 of the 15 riders in that very first Derby. The first 28 runnings of the Kentucky Derby, the 15 of those first 28 runnings were won by African-American jockeys. Isaac Murphy is recognized as one of the greatest jockeys to ever ride in thoroughbred racing. He was born in Kentucky in 1861. His mother was enslaved, and so that meant, by the rules of the institution of slavery, that Isaac Murphy was also born a slave in 1861. Isaac Murphy starts riding horses at a very young age. He's very adept at riding. He rides a lot of the top races of his day. He won 3 Kentucky Derbies. He's the first jockey to ever win 3 Kentucky Derbies. He won his most recent in 1891. It is estimated that his winning percentage throughout his career was around 44%. But if you compare that to modern jockeys, a good rate for a jockey riding at the highest level in today's world of thoroughbred racing is probably going to be in the mid to high 20%. And he was the very first jockey ever inducted into Thoroughbred Racing's Hall of Fame in 1955. So that gives you an idea of how dominant Isaac Murphy was on the racetrack as a jockey in the 19th century. Jimmy Wingfield was the last African-American jockey to win the Kentucky Derby in 1902. He also won it in 1901. But his career in America was actually relatively short, late 1890s up until about 1903. And then he actually left for Europe. The reason for that exodus is due to racism. We have instances, again, of the rough riding in some tracks where African Americans are being intimidated by white counterparts. I think Isaac Murphy and Jimmy Wingfield fit into the larger story of the American narrative at the late 19th and early 20th century. Basically, it's a statement that if you work your hardest, you'll be successful in this country. And Isaac Murphy and Jimmy Wingfield faced great obstacles to make that happen. In the 19th, early 20th century, in America, and especially and even in regards to racing, they're facing segregation, which sees the diminishing participation of African-American jockeys. But despite that obstacle, or any of those obstacles, Isaac Murphy wins 3 Kentucky Derbies. Jimmy Wingfield wins 2 Kentucky Derbies and goes on to have a successful racing career in Russia and France. So these 2 gentlemen really are emblematic of that narrative. Visitors to the museum that are able to stop by and absorb our exhibition on African Americans and thoroughbred racing, I think what's so engaging and what's so interesting is they do leave wanting to know more. So many of the jockeys that we're talking about relating to this Kentucky Derby history, they were born here in Kentucky. They resided here in Kentucky. Their legacy, at least as part of the Kentucky Derby, is tied to Kentucky and even other races in Kentucky. So it's a poignant story for us. It ties us to our place, it ties us to our community. Most of us aren't fortunate enough to have the athletic skill to be a jockey, but we can still appreciate the story and appreciate where it happened and why it happened and when it happened. And that really ties us to our community identity and really ties us to these stories.
This is just one of many stories that can be heard and experienced only in Kentucky.